Every night she looked out that same window, waiting for the cowboy who promised to return. She waited because she believed. He rode because he had to. But some promises take longer to keep than either expected. Not because of distance, not because of danger, but because sometimes the journey home is the hardest ride a man will ever make. The window faced west. That mattered to Grace Hartley, mattered more than anything else when she'd chosen this room in her father's ranch house 3 years ago. West was where the sun set. West was where the trails led away from Redemption Creek into the territories beyond. West was where Daniel Morgan had ridden that April morning, promising to return before winter, promising to make enough money to finally ask her father for her hand properly, promising to come back to her. That first winter, Grace had stood at this window every evening, watching the horizon turn gold and crimson and purple before fading to darkness. She'd watched through the snow and the wind, through Christmas and New Year's, through her 21st birthday when her mother had gently suggested that perhaps it was time to accept that some men made promises they didn't keep. Grace had smiled and said nothing and returned to her window after the guests had left. Now she was 24. Daniel had been gone for 3 years. And still, every evening as the sun began its descent, Grace found herself at this window, looking west. Her father thought it was foolish. Her mother thought it was heartbreaking. The neighbors had stopped asking about Daniel Morgan entirely, his name becoming something people avoided in her presence like an embarrassing scar. But Grace kept her vigil, because Daniel hadn't been like other men who made careless promises. He'd looked into her eyes that morning and said the words with the kind of certainty that made you believe impossible things. "I'll come back, Grace, however long it takes, whatever I have to do, I'll come back to you." She'd believed him then. Somehow, despite everything, she believed him still. Daniel Morgan had never meant to be gone 3 years. He'd planned 6 months, maybe 8 at the outside. He'd ride south into Texas, work the cattle drives, save every dollar he could, and return to Redemption Creek with enough money to prove to Grace's father that he was more than just a drifter with a good horse and empty pockets. He'd prove he could provide for a wife, could build something lasting, could be worthy of Grace Hartley. The first year had gone according to plan. He'd worked 3 drives, saved nearly everything he'd earned, sent letters whenever he passed through a town with postal service. Short letters, awkward because Daniel had never been good with words on paper, but full of details about the work, the land, the promise that he'd be home soon. Then the second year everything changed. A late-season stampede had caught him in the open, had crushed his right leg so badly the camp doctor had wanted to amputate. Daniel had refused, had spent 6 months in agony learning to walk again, had spent every dollar he'd saved on medical care and recovery. When he could finally ride again, his leg was saved, but his savings were gone. Worse, the injury had left him with a limp that made it harder to find work on the drives that required men who could move fast and stay in the saddle for days. He'd written to Grace, told her about the injury, told her he'd be delayed. Her letter back had been simple and devastating in its faith. "I'll wait. Come home when you can." The third year he'd taken whatever work he could find. Breaking horses, guarding cattle shipments. Once work that shamed him even now, riding with men who skirted the edge of the law in ways that made him sick. But he needed money, needed to rebuild what he'd lost, needed to go home with something to show for the time he'd been gone. 3 years was already too long. He couldn't come back with nothing. Couldn't face Grace's father as the same empty-pocketed drifter he'd been when he left. So he'd stayed. 1 more month, 1 more job, 1 more stake that might finally give him enough. And the months had stretched into years, and Daniel had become something he'd never intended to be. A man who broke promises, a man who didn't come home. In Redemption Creek, Grace's mother tried one last time. They sat together in the parlor, the older woman's face gentle with concern as she watched her daughter stare out the window at another dying sunset. "Grace, sweetheart, it's been 3 years. I know how long it's been, Mama. Your father and I worry about you. You're 24 years old. You should be building a life, not waiting for a ghost." Grace turned from the window, her eyes calm and certain. "He's not a ghost. He's just delayed. 3 years is more than a delay, darling." It's what it takes," Grace interrupted softly. "Sometimes things take longer than we expect." "That doesn't mean they won't happen," her mother sighed. "William Patterson asked your father again about courting you. He's a good man, Grace. Established. He'd treat you well. I know he would, Grace agreed. But I don't love him. I love Daniel. How can you love someone who hasn't come back? Who hasn't even written in over a year? Grace had no answer for that. The letters had stopped 14 months ago. She didn't know why. Didn't know if something terrible had happened or if Daniel had simply given up, moved on, forgotten the promise he'd made. But she knew what she felt, knew it with the same certainty she'd known that April morning when he'd ridden away. She loved Daniel Morgan, and she would wait. Her mother stood, came to her, took her hands gently. I just don't want you to waste your life waiting for something that might never come. It's my life to waste, Mama, Grace said, not unkindly. And I don't consider it wasted. After her mother left, Grace returned to the window. The sun was nearly gone now, just a sliver of gold on the western horizon. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and whispered the same prayer she'd whispered every evening for 3 years. Come home, Daniel. Wherever you are, whatever happened, just come home. In a town called Silver Ridge, 2 days' ride southwest of Redemption Creek, Daniel Morgan sat in a saloon nursing a whiskey he couldn't really afford. He'd been in this town for 3 months, working at the livery stable, sleeping in the hayloft, saving every penny he could. He was close now, close to having enough to go home, close to fulfilling the promise that had haunted him for 3 years. But fear kept him frozen. Fear of what he'd find when he went back. Would Grace still be waiting? Or would he return to discover she'd married someone else, someone reliable who hadn't broken his promise by staying away so long? And even if she had waited, how could he face her father as a man who'd failed so completely? He'd left promising to return in 6 months with enough money to prove himself. He was returning after 3 years with barely more than he'd left with, and a bad leg besides. You look like a man with regrets, said a voice beside him. Daniel glanced over to find an old cowboy settling onto the next stool, weathered face creased with lines that spoke of decades under the sun. Don't mind me. Just making conversation. Got nothing to talk about, Daniel muttered. The old cowboy signaled the bartender for a drink. Every man who sits alone in a saloon staring at whiskey got something to talk about. Usually a woman, a mistake, or both. Despite himself, Daniel smiled faintly. Both. Ah, the worst kind. The old man's drink arrived and he sipped it thoughtfully. Let me guess. Made her a promise you couldn't keep. Tried to keep it. Just took longer than I planned. How much longer? 3 years. The old cowboy whistled low. That's a long time for a woman to wait. She's still waiting? I don't know, Daniel admitted, and the words hurt to say. Haven't written in over a year. Didn't know what to tell her. That I was still trying? That I'd failed? That every day I stayed away made me more of a coward? So you stayed away because you were afraid, the old man said bluntly. I stayed away because I wanted to come back right, with something to show for the time I'd been gone, with enough to prove I was worth waiting for. The old cowboy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that hit Daniel like a physical blow. Son, if she's been waiting 3 years, she ain't waiting for your money. She's waiting for you. And every day you don't go back, you're breaking that promise all over again. Daniel stared into his whiskey glass, seeing his own distorted reflection. What if I go back and she's gone? Married someone else. Then at least you'll know. At least you'll have tried. The old man finished his drink and stood, dropping a coin on the bar. But I'll tell you something I learned the hard way. Regret for trying and failing is bearable. Regret for not trying at all will eat you alive. Your choice which one you want to carry. He walked out, leaving Daniel alone with his whiskey and his fear and his conscience. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He lay in the hayloft, staring at the stars through the gaps in the roof, thinking about Grace standing at her window, thinking about 3 years of broken promises and accumulated shame. Thinking about the old cowboy's words. She's waiting for you. Not your money, you. Before dawn, Daniel made his decision. He saddled his horse, collected his wages from the livery owner, and rode out of Silver Ridge, heading northeast. Toward Redemption Creek, toward Grace, toward whatever waited for him there, forgiveness or rejection, acceptance or anger. It didn't matter anymore. The old cowboy was right. Not trying was its own kind of death. It took him 3 days to reach Redemption Creek. 3 days of riding hard, of rehearsing what he'd say, of alternating between hope and terror. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon, the town quiet, most people at church or at home with their families. Daniel's heart hammered as he rode down Main Street. Nothing had changed. The same buildings, the same church steeple rising above the other structures, the same sense of a place that time moved through slowly. He knew where the Hartley Ranch was. 5 miles north of town, a prosperous spread with good water and better grazing. He rode out there without stopping, knowing that if he delayed even for an hour, he might lose his nerve entirely. The ranch house looked exactly as he remembered it. White painted wood, a wide porch, the window on the second floor that faced west. Grace's window. Daniel dismounted at the gate, his bad leg protesting after 3 days of hard riding. He limped up the path to the front door, removed his hat, and knocked. Grace's father answered. Robert Hartley was a big man, weathered by ranch work, with a direct gaze that had intimidated Daniel 3 years ago and still did now. His eyes widened slightly when he recognized his visitor. "Daniel Morgan," he said, not warmly but not with hostility either. Just acknowledgement. "Mr. Hartley, sir, I came to see Grace, if she'll see me." Robert studied him for a long moment. "You're 3 years late." "Yes, sir. I know. You wrote for a while, then stopped." "Yes, sir, I didn't know what to say. You could have said you were alive. Could have told her something." Robert's voice hardened. "Do you know what it's been like for her?" 3 years of not knowing. "No, sir," Daniel said quietly. "But I can imagine it was hard. And I'm sorry. Sorrier than I can say. Sorry isn't much to show for 3 years. No, sir, it isn't." Daniel met the older man's eyes directly. "I left here promising to make something of myself, to come back worthy of your daughter. Instead, I failed at that, got injured, spent everything I'd saved just learning to walk again, spent 3 years trying to rebuild what I'd lost. And in doing that, I broke the one promise that mattered." He paused. "But I'm here now. And if Grace will see me, if she'll listen, I'll spend whatever time it takes making this right." Robert Hartley studied him a moment longer. Then he stepped aside. "She's upstairs. Western window. She's been waiting there every evening for 3 years. Every single evening, watching for you." The words hit Daniel harder than any physical blow could have. "Every evening?" "Every evening," Robert confirmed. "Now get up there and end her wait." One way or another, Daniel climbed the stairs with his bad leg protesting every step. At the top, he found the door to Grace's room slightly ajar. He pushed it open slowly. Grace stood at the window, her back to him, silhouetted against the afternoon light. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't turn at the sound of the door. "Mama, I told you I'm fine," she said softly. "It's not your mother," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. Grace went completely still. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, very slowly, she turned around. Her face was older than he remembered, not with age, but with the kind of maturity that came from long waiting. Her eyes were the same, though. Dark and deep and steady. "Daniel," she whispered, and her voice held everything. Relief, joy, anger, pain, love. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate, but all he had. "I'm so sorry, Grace. I promised 6 months and it took 3 years. I promised to come back worthy and I came back with almost nothing. I promised to write and I stopped because I was ashamed. I broke every promise except the one that mattered most." "Which one was that?" Grace asked, her voice barely audible. "That I'd come back. That no matter what, I'd come back to you." Grace crossed the room in 3 steps and hit him. Not hard, not really. Just her fist against his chest. Once, twice, 3 times, while tears streamed down her face. 3 years, she said, hitting him again. 3 years I stood at that window. 3 years I waited. 3 years Daniel caught her hands, held them gently. "I know, your father told me. Every evening, all this time. Why didn't you come back sooner? Why didn't you write?" "Because I was a fool," Daniel said simply. "Because I thought I had to prove something, had to come back with money and success. Because I was so focused on being worthy that I forgot the only thing that mattered was keeping my promise. And I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry." Grace sagged against him, her forehead pressing against his chest, her body shaking with sobs. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, holding her as gently as he'd hold something precious and breakable. "I don't care about the money," she whispered against his shirt. "I never cared about that. I just wanted you. Just you. I know that now," Daniel said. "Took me 3 years and a wise old cowboy to figure it out, but I know it now." They stood there in the fading afternoon light, holding each other, years of separation and pain slowly beginning to dissolve. Finally, Grace pulled back enough to look up at him. "You're limping. Bad injury on a cattle drive. Leg got crushed. Spent everything I'd saved on medical care. Is it healed?" "Mostly still hurts when it rains. Makes me slower than I used to be." Grace touched his face gently. "I don't care if you're slow. I don't care if you limp. I don't care about any of it. I just care that you're here." "I'm here," Daniel confirmed. "And I'm not leaving again. Not ever, if you'll have me. If you can forgive me for taking so long." "I forgave you the day you left," Grace said softly. "I've been waiting all this time to tell you so." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. But for the first time in 3 years, Grace wasn't watching it. She was looking at Daniel, seeing the man who'd kept his promise, even if it took far longer than either of them expected. They were married a month later in the small church in Redemption Creek. Grace wore a dress her mother had made, simple but beautiful. Daniel wore new clothes bought with the last of his savings. And he stood at the altar with his bad leg aching and his heart full, watching Grace walk toward him and thinking about all the evenings she'd stood at her window waiting. After the ceremony, as they stood on the church steps accepting congratulations, Grace leaned close and whispered, "I don't have to look out the window anymore." Daniel pulled her closer. "Why not?" "Because what I was waiting for is finally here." Years later, they would tell their children about the 3-year wait, about the promise that took so long to keep. They'd talk about faith and patience and the stubbornness of believing in something even when everything suggested you should give up. And they'd teach them that sometimes the most important promises are the ones that take the longest to fulfill, because those are the ones worth waiting for. Grace never looked out that western window with longing again. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, she'd stand there with Daniel beside her, watching the sunset together, and she'd remember the years she'd stood there alone, waiting and believing. And she'd be grateful for every evening she'd spent watching the horizon, because each one had been a step closer to the moment when Daniel finally rode home.